That night, I thought I was ending a relationship. But 2 weeks later, the truth showed up at my door, and it was nothing like I expected. The clock on the living room wall ticked with slow, stubborn patience. Every second sounded louder than it should have, echoing through the quiet apartment like a reminder that the night was stretching longer than expected. It was already past 3 in the morning. The lamp beside the couch cast a soft, yellow glow across the room. Everything looked calm on the surface: the folded blanket on the armrest, the coffee table with 2 empty mugs from earlier that evening, the faint shadow of the curtain swaying gently from the slightly open window. But inside, nothing felt calm. She had said she'd be home before midnight. At first, waiting didn't feel unusual. Sometimes work ran late. Sometimes friends wanted to talk longer than planned. Life had its small delays. There had always been trust between them, the kind that made explanations unnecessary. But as the hours passed, the silence began to feel heavier. Midnight turned into 1. 1 turned into 2. Messages had been sent. None were answered. By the time the clock reached 3, the narrator wasn't even sitting anymore. He stood near the window, arms crossed loosely, staring down at the quiet street below. The occasional passing car headlights slid across the walls before disappearing again. Then finally, headlights slowed outside. A car door closed. Footsteps. The familiar sound of keys gently turning in the lock. The door opened slowly, almost carefully. She stepped inside, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she closed the door behind her. Her movements were calm, almost too calm, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. For a brief moment, she didn't notice him standing there. She slipped off her shoes near the entrance and set her purse down on the small table by the door. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the way someone's does after a long night. Then she looked up. Their eyes met. Surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by something quieter, something harder to read. "Still awake?" she asked softly. Her voice carried the same familiar warmth it always had, but something about the moment felt different. Not wrong exactly, just off. The narrator didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step closer. The space between them closed to only a few feet. And that's when he noticed it. A faint scent in the air. Cologne. Not his. It wasn't overpowering, just subtle enough to be unmistakable once noticed. A masculine scent that lingered as she moved past him toward the kitchen. His chest tightened slightly, though his face stayed calm. She avoided looking at him directly, busying herself with small things instead. Opening the refrigerator. Pouring a glass of water. Moving with quiet precision. Too quiet. Too careful. For years, their home had always felt open, filled with easy conversation, small laughs, comfortable silence. Tonight, every movement felt deliberate, like both of them were walking across thin ice. He watched her fingers wrap around the glass. Watched the small pause before she took a sip. Memories tried to rise in his mind, mornings spent cooking together, evenings where she rested her head on his shoulder while watching movies. But the unfamiliar scent still hung between them. He stepped a little closer. "Long night?" he finally asked. She nodded, still not quite meeting his eyes. "Yeah, something like that." The answer felt unfinished. A long silence filled the room. He realized something then, not with explosive anger, not with certainty, but with a quiet, sinking feeling deep in his chest. Sometimes trust doesn't break loudly. Sometimes it cracks in silence. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm. "You should pack a bag." Now she looked up. Confusion spread across her face. "Pack a bag." He nodded once. "You have 15 minutes. The words hung in the air between them. No yelling. No accusations. Just a decision that felt heavier than either of them were ready to admit. The apartment felt different the moment the door closed behind her. Not louder. Not emptier in the obvious sense. Just, hollow. For a long time, he stood exactly where he had been when she walked out. The hallway light was still on, casting a pale glow across the floor where her suitcase wheels had rolled toward the door only minutes earlier. 15 minutes. That was all he had given her. And she hadn't argued. That part kept replaying in his mind. He expected anger. Expected questions. Maybe even tears. But instead, she had simply looked at him with quiet disbelief, nodded once, and disappeared into the bedroom. The silence while she packed had been unbearable. Drawers opening. Closet doors sliding. The soft rustle of clothes being folded and placed inside the suitcase. Once, she stepped past him in the hallway carrying a small stack of sweaters. Their shoulders brushed lightly as she passed. The contact was brief, but the familiar warmth of her presence sent a strange ache through his chest. Neither of them said a word. When she finally rolled the suitcase toward the door, she paused for just a moment. Her hand rested on the handle as she looked around the apartment, the couch, the small dining table, the framed photo on the wall from a trip they had taken together months ago. Her lips parted slightly like she wanted to say something. But she didn't. Instead, she quietly opened the door. And then she was gone. Now the apartment felt frozen in time. He slowly walked into the kitchen, the same place where she had stood only an hour earlier. Her glass still sat on the counter with a little water left inside. A faint mark from her lipstick curved along the rim. Without thinking, he picked it up. His fingers traced the edge of the glass before he set it back down again. The silence pressed in from every direction. He moved through the apartment slowly, noticing things he had never paid attention to before. Her sweater was still draped over the back of the dining chair. The soft fabric looked slightly worn, the sleeves hanging loosely as if she had taken it off earlier that evening before leaving. He picked it up carefully. The scent of her perfume lingered faintly in the material, soft and familiar. For years, that scent had meant comfort. Late nights on the couch. Quiet mornings drinking coffee together while sunlight crept through the window. Now it only made the apartment feel more empty. He folded the sweater slowly and set it down on the table. The living room clock kept ticking. Every second seemed louder now. He sank down onto the couch and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands rubbed slowly over his face as the events of the night replayed again and again. 3 a.m. The unfamiliar cologne. Her careful silence. But something else lingered beneath the anger. Doubt. Not doubt about what he smelled. But doubt about the decision he made. He had acted quickly, too quickly, maybe. The truth was, he hadn't shouted because he was furious. He had stayed calm because he was hurt. Deeply hurt. And sometimes hurt makes people do things they don't fully understand until the quiet arrives afterward. His eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. Her side of the closet was half empty now. Her shoes by the door were gone. Even the bathroom looked different without the small collection of things she always left near the sink. It was amazing how quickly a shared life could start to feel like a stranger's place. He leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. The cologne still lingered in his memory like a question without an answer. And for the first time since she left, he wondered if the story of that night might be more complicated than it seemed. The message came the next morning. It arrived quietly, almost cautiously, like someone knocking on a door they weren't sure would open. His phone vibrated once on the kitchen counter while he stood there staring into a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. He hadn't slept much. Maybe an hour at most. The night had passed in restless silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the building and the steady ticking of the clock in the living room. When he picked up the phone, her name on the screen made his chest tighten. The message was short. Can we talk? Just once. Please. He stared at the words for a long time. Part of him wanted to ignore it. Pretend the conversation had already ended the moment she walked out with that suitcase. But another part of him, the part that still remembered quiet evenings and familiar laughter, needed to hear what she had to say. They agreed to meet at a small cafe a few blocks away. Late morning. Neutral ground. The kind of place where conversation stayed calm because strangers sat only a few feet away. When he arrived, she was already there. She sat near the window, sunlight filtering softly through the glass behind her. Her hands were wrapped around a warm coffee cup, fingers curled tightly as if the heat helped steady her. For a moment, he simply stood there watching her. She looked different. Not in appearance, she wore the same soft sweater he'd seen her wear dozens of times before, but something in her posture had changed. Her shoulders seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by something invisible. When she noticed him, she looked up slowly. Their eyes met. A flicker of relief crossed her face, followed quickly by nervousness. He walked over and sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke right away. The quiet between them felt fragile. Outside the window, people passed by on the sidewalk, their lives moving forward without any awareness of the tension sitting at the small cafe table. Finally, she broke the silence. "Thank you for coming." Her voice was softer than usual, almost careful. He nodded once but didn't say anything. Up close, he noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind that come from a night without sleep. She looked down at her coffee again, turning the cup slightly in her hands. "I know what it looked like last night," she said quietly. The sentence hung in the air between them. He leaned back slightly in his chair, arms resting loosely against the sides. "Then you know why I reacted the way I did?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then something small happened, something familiar. Her hand slowly slid across the table. Not far. Just enough for her fingertips to lightly touch his wrist. The contact was gentle, almost hesitant, like someone reaching for a fragile piece of glass. His instinct was to pull away. But he didn't. The warmth of her fingers resting against his skin stirred memories he hadn't expected to feel so quickly again. Late-night conversations. Quiet drives with her hand resting in his. Simple moments that once felt permanent. Her voice lowered slightly. "The scent you noticed, it wasn't what you think." He watched her carefully. Not accusing. Not forgiving. Just listening. She took a slow breath before continuing. "I was helping someone." His brow furrowed slightly. "Helping someone." She nodded again. "Someone from my past. An old friend." There was hesitation in her voice, not the hesitation of someone lying, but the hesitation of someone unsure if the truth would be believed. "He's been going through something really bad," she continued softly. "Last night things got worse. I stayed longer than I should have trying to calm him down." The cafe around them hummed with quiet background noise, cups clinking, soft conversations, a distant espresso machine steaming milk. But at their table, everything felt suspended. He studied her expression. Her eyes. The way her fingers still rested lightly against his wrist, not gripping, not pleading, just there. Waiting. Still, the question remained. If the night had been innocent, why hadn't she told him sooner? After the conversation at the cafe, nothing returned to normal. Not immediately. They didn't suddenly fall back into the easy rhythm they once had. Instead, something quieter happened, a slow, uncertain rebuilding. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a bridge that had cracked in the middle, both wondering if it was safe to take another step. For the next few days, their conversations were careful. Short messages. Occasional phone calls. Nothing heavy, nothing emotional, just small check-ins that felt polite rather than natural. Still, neither of them disappeared. That alone meant something. A week later, she suggested meeting again. This time somewhere quieter. A park not far from the neighborhood they used to walk through together. The kind of place where wide paths curved between tall trees and wooden benches faced small ponds where ducks drifted slowly across the water. It was early evening when they met. The air had started to cool, carrying that faint crispness that comes with the start of autumn. Leaves had begun turning shades of gold and amber, and every step along the path produced a soft crunch beneath their shoes. For a while, they simply walked side by side. Not touching. Not quite distant either. Just close enough to feel each other's presence. The sun was beginning to lower behind the trees, sending warm streaks of orange light through the branches. The soft glow reflected gently off the path ahead of them. He noticed little things as they walked. The way she tucked her hands into the sleeves of her sweater when the breeze picked up. The way her hair moved slightly across her cheek before she brushed it back behind her ear. Familiar gestures. Ones he had watched countless times before. Yet now, every small movement seemed to carry a quiet tension between them. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking about that night," she said softly. He kept his eyes on the path ahead. "Me too." Her voice held a hint of uncertainty. "I should have told you where I was going earlier. I didn't think it would matter, but I guess it did." He exhaled slowly. It did. The honesty didn't sound harsh, just real. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. The path curved slightly near a small wooden bridge that crossed over a narrow stream. Fallen leaves floated gently across the water, carried slowly by the current. As they stepped onto the bridge, something unexpected happened. Her foot slipped slightly on one of the smooth wooden planks. It wasn't dramatic, just a quick loss of balance. Instinctively, his hand reached out. His fingers wrapped around her forearm, steadying her before she could fall. For a brief moment, they froze like that. His hand still holding her arm. Her other hand lightly gripping the railing. The contact felt strangely electric. Not intense, just deeply familiar. She looked up at him, a small breath escaping her lips as she steadied herself. "Thanks," she murmured. But neither of them pulled away immediately. His hand remained around her arm a second longer than necessary. Her skin felt warm beneath his fingers. When he finally released her, the absence of that touch felt noticeable. They continued walking across the bridge and back onto the path. But something had shifted. The distance between them, emotional and physical, suddenly felt more complicated. Not gone. Just thinner. The connection was still there. In the way their shoulders occasionally brushed as the path narrowed. In the quiet glances they shared when the other wasn't looking. Trust wasn't fully repaired. Not yet. But as they walked beneath the fading light of the evening sky, it became clear that neither of them had truly walked away from the story they once shared. The rain started just after sunset. Not heavy at first, just a soft tapping against the windows, the kind that made the city outside feel quieter than usual. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long golden streaks across the glass. He hadn't planned to come over. After their walk in the park, they had continued talking through messages for a few more days. The conversations were longer now, less guarded. Still cautious, but warmer than before. That evening, she had asked if he could stop by. Just to talk, she had said. Now he sat on the far end of her couch, the faint sound of rain filling the spaces between their words. Her apartment looked familiar in some ways, the same soft lighting, the same neatly arranged books on the shelf, but it also felt slightly different without the life they once shared inside it. She sat across from him at first, on the edge of a chair, her hands wrapped tightly around a warm mug. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued its quiet rhythm against the window. Finally, she took a breath. "I think you deserve the full truth," she said. Her voice wasn't defensive. If anything, it sounded tired, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for too long. He nodded slightly, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. "I'm listening." She looked down into her cup for a moment before continuing. "The person I went to see that night, his name is Daniel." The name hung quietly in the air. "Daniel and I knew each other years ago," she explained. "Long before you and I met." Her fingers traced slowly along the edge of the mug. He called me that evening out of nowhere. I almost didn't answer. She paused briefly. But when I heard his voice, something was wrong. Outside, the rain grew a little stronger. He's been struggling for a while, she continued softly. Lost his job, going through a divorce, everything seemed to collapse for him at once. Her eyes finally lifted to meet his. That night he sounded broken. The word lingered heavily. I went over just to make sure he was okay, she said. I thought I'd stay for maybe half an hour. But things didn't go the way she expected. He was drinking, she admitted. Not angry, just lost. He kept talking about how everything in his life had fallen apart. She swallowed slightly. At one point he started crying. The narrator shifted slightly on the couch, listening carefully. I stayed longer because I didn't want to leave him alone like that, she said quietly. The faint scent he remembered suddenly made more sense in his mind. She noticed the realization in his expression. The cologne, she said softly. It must have rubbed off when I hugged him. Her voice trembled slightly now. Not because I loved him. Not because there was anything between us. She looked down again. I hugged him because he looked like someone who had completely run out of strength. The room fell quiet again except for the rain. Then she said the part that seemed to weigh on her the most. My mistake wasn't going there. Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. My mistake was not telling you. She looked up at him again, eyes glistening slightly. I knew how it would look. I knew it might sound strange. A tear slipped down her cheek before she quickly brushed it away. And instead of trusting you with the truth, I avoided the conversation. The silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. Just heavy with honesty. Slowly, he reached across the small space between them. His hand gently closed around hers. The contact was soft. Careful. But full of meaning. For the first time since that night, the distance between them felt like it might finally be closing. Trust doesn't return all at once. It doesn't arrive with one conversation or a single explanation. Instead, it moves slowly, quietly, rebuilt through small moments that almost seem insignificant until you realize how much they mean. After that night in her apartment, things began to change. Not dramatically. Just, steadily. The tension that once filled every silence between them began to soften. They started spending time together again, but this time there was a quiet awareness in both of them, a shared understanding that what they were rebuilding needed patience. One evening, she invited him over for dinner. It felt strange walking through her door again, even though the place looked exactly the same. The warm light in the kitchen, the familiar scent of garlic and onions cooking on the stove, the quiet music playing somewhere in the background. For a moment, it almost felt like stepping back into an old memory. She stood near the stove stirring something in a pan when he arrived. When she turned and saw him in the doorway, her face softened into a small smile, not the wide carefree smile she once had, but something gentler. Perfect timing, she said. I was starting to think I might burn this. He stepped into the kitchen, setting his jacket on the chair. You burn food, he teased lightly. That would be a first. The comment made her laugh softly. It was the first time he had heard that sound from her in weeks. And somehow, it made the room feel warmer. They cooked together the way they used to. Passing ingredients. Reaching for the same utensils at the same time. At one point, both of them reached for the wooden spoon resting beside the stove. Their fingers touched briefly, the contact unexpected but familiar. Neither of them pulled away quickly. Instead, they exchanged a small glance before one of them stepped back, smiling slightly. It wasn't dramatic. But it meant something. Later, they sat at the small dining table eating dinner. Conversation flowed more naturally now, stories from work, small jokes, observations about the day. Nothing heavy. Just normal life returning slowly. After dinner, they moved to the living room. A movie played quietly on the television, though neither of them paid much attention to it. The soft glow from the screen flickered across the room as they sat side by side on the couch. At first, there was a small space between them. Not much. Just enough to remind them of the distance that had once been there. Halfway through the movie, she shifted slightly. Without really thinking about it, she leaned her head gently against his shoulder. The movement was slow, cautious, like someone testing whether the moment was welcome. He didn't move away. Instead, he relaxed slightly into the couch. For a few minutes they simply sat like that, the quiet sound of the movie filling the room. Then he felt her hand resting lightly beside his. He hesitated only for a moment before placing his hand over hers. Her fingers responded almost immediately, curling softly around his. The warmth of that touch felt different now. More deliberate. More meaningful. Trust wasn't fully healed yet. There were still memories of that night, still questions that time would slowly answer. But sitting there together, her head resting quietly on his shoulder, their hands gently intertwined. It felt like the beginning of something strong enough to grow again. Not the same love they once had. Something deeper. Something rebuilt. Weeks had passed since that rainy night in her apartment, and life had begun to settle into a fragile rhythm. The tension that had once hung between them like a heavy fog had softened into something quieter, subtler, a shared understanding that rebuilding a bond was never instantaneous, but possible. They had started spending time together again, cautiously, each moment measured yet filled with significance. That evening, he suggested returning to the park where they had first walked after the storm of doubt. The same park where autumn leaves had crunched beneath their feet, where the air had carried that faint crispness signaling change. Now, the season had deepened, and the path was scattered with a golden-brown carpet of leaves, the faint rustle beneath their shoes matching the rhythm of their tentative hearts. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm, orange glow that spilled across the pond. Ducks drifted lazily in the water, leaving ripples that shimmered in the fading light. It was quiet, almost too quiet, a perfect space for honesty, for reflection, for letting words finally mean something. They walked side by side, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, each contact electric yet familiar. Neither of them spoke immediately, sometimes silence carries more weight than conversation. He noticed the way she moved, graceful yet cautious, as if every step forward was measured against the memory of the night that had almost broken them. Finally, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," she said softly. Her voice wasn't pleading or defensive, just honest, raw, and steady. He glanced at her, noticing the subtle vulnerability in her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers fidgeted with the cuff of her sweater. "I know," he replied. "I've been thinking too." They stopped walking near a bench overlooking the pond. She stood beside him, a small distance apart, yet the warmth radiating between them made it feel like there was no space at all. He watched her closely, remembering the long nights, the quiet conversations, the laughter that had once been effortless. The memory of that night at 3 a.m. lingered still, sharp yet distant, softened by the truth she had shared and the patience he had managed to summon. She finally reached out and let her fingers find his. The touch was gentle, deliberate, familiar, the kind of contact that spoke volumes without a single word. He took her hand fully in his, squeezing softly, letting her know that he was present, that he had returned not only physically but emotionally. For a long moment, they simply stood there. The world around them seemed to pause, the wind rustling the leaves, the faint quack of a duck, the shimmer of water catching the last rays of sunlight. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic confession. Just two people acknowledging the fragile beauty of what they had rebuilt. "I know that night hurt," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But walking away forever, that would have hurt more." Her eyes glistened in the amber light. She leaned lightly against him, resting her head on his shoulder. His arm instinctively wrapped around her, pulling her closer without force, letting her settle into the comfort of familiarity. The promise wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. Their hands intertwined, their bodies close yet not demanding, their hearts slowly sinking again. That quiet, mutual understanding was all the promise they needed. Sometimes love doesn't need fireworks. Sometimes it's just the calm certainty of being there, choosing each other over the fear that once threatened to tear everything apart. And in that golden light, standing amidst falling leaves, they chose each other, together and secure, finally at peace. Red Heart.